Welcome to SportsBeat KC, the Kansas City Star's daily sports podcast. It's Thursday, May 11th, and I'm Blair Kirchhoff. It has been an unexpectedly rough start for Sporting Kansas City this season. The team is coming off its first victory in 11 games heading into Saturday's contest against Minnesota. But the worst part is Sporting is continuing its trend from 2022 when its record matched the second worst in the Western Conference. On today's show, star columnist and former Sporting beat writer Sam McDowell sat down with principal owner Mike Illig and team president Jake Reid to discuss the state of the team and coach Peter Vermes. Vermes is the longest tenured coach in MLS and one of the longest tenured in global professional soccer. He is synonymous with Sporting KC. But how safe is Vermes? Is his job on the line this season? The question and many others is explored on today's show. Okay, let's get started. Sam, you spoke with Sporting principal owner Mike Illig and president and CEO Jake Reid for a story about the state of the team, which is off to a horrendous start. One victory in 11 games, although they are coming off a huge victory in Seattle against the first-place team in the West. You wrote a column, and Illig called the team start an embarrassment. You know, the funny thing is, Sam, we got to talk to Peter Vermes and players at the Super Bowl, right?
Yeah.
They were,
yeah.
And the feeling was optimism then, and everybody was kind of feeling good about the season coming off of the disappointing 2022 year. But it's just been a terrible start. And we'll get into Peter Vermes in a minute, but just talk about why you dived into this topic.
Yeah, well, I think that when things are going the way they are, and we've got two organizations in town that we can say this about, with the Royals as well, that ownership owes the fans a message for what their viewpoint of it is. And, you know, we did talk to John Sherman a week ago, and his messages were this is part of it. And then, you know, we heard something that was quite contrasting from Mike Illig that says, like you mentioned, he said it's an embarrassment. This is not at all where they plan to be. This is not part of any process they're going to. They expected to be competitive, you know, with anybody in the league this year. And I think, like you mentioned, that the Seattle match showed that there's capability when they have their guys. But I probably should have put this in the column. Mike Illig even said to me when he opened, he said, I wish I would have talked to you on Saturday before that match. Because, you know, this is about the full picture, not just what the team had done a day before on Sunday. That doesn't, like you mentioned, just suddenly make everything seem like it's roses and flowers. They've got everything all figured out. I mean, we'll find out over the course of the season whether that match was a weird MLS result, which we see a lot in that league, or whether it is the start of a new trend. But yeah, I mean, absolutely what prompted me was, first of all, Sporting has always given great access. They've always made people available. And
a model franchise in that way.
Absolutely.
In many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you read the entire column, it's if you don't know the franchise, you should be shocked by some of the things that an owner is willing to put out there.
Mm-hmm. An openness, just an openness. I read it in a sense that he has a pulse on the fans' feelings about this team, and
Definitely, yeah.
And I really appreciate that. Now he, in his position, and has every right to do this, tries to go deeper and tries to explain what he thinks or his interpretation of what the problems have been, and injuries, of course. I mean, there's no denying it. It's been a big part of it last year and this year. Let's get the record out. So. From the beginning of last year, Sporting is 12, 23, and 10. That is just an unacceptable record for this organization. But yeah, that wasn't new news. But to hear him, address it, I thought, I'm glad he did. But it's becoming less of a reason for the results for Sporting.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think people have become immune to it because they've heard it so often. And to be fair, we heard like injuries used as rationale before Polito and Quinto were out. But I really more than any other topic, fought back with him on the injury stuff when we were having a conversation. And I said, look, you guys used to be a club that I was constantly told, hey, the moves are made because it's not about one or two players. You know, they moved on from Dom Dwyer, they moved on from Ike Opara, they moved on from Kai Kamara. All those guys were in the primes of their career, and the message was always that, well, this club is bigger than one or two players. And to me, it goes against that whenever you point to one or two players being out as the rationale for why things aren't going well. And like I said, I told him that. I said, you know, this was the message you guys used to have, and that contrasts with the message I'm hearing now. And he said, well, Polito cost $8 million as a transfer. Gadi Kinda cost $4 million as a transfer. The club had probably spent $4 million total on transfers before. He said, so these are two players of a different caliber that are out. And there is a lot of truth to that. I mean, they've played well with those guys who are in the lineup. But I also think it's and this is what I phrased to him. I said, listen, when it's an excuse for not being in first place in the Western Conference over the last 2 years. It's not an excuse for getting your first win of the season 11 games into the season. It's factually true that they have not responded well to these guys being out. And listen, he agreed with that. And as Mike Illig is answering, Jake Reid is nodding his head. Yes. I mean, so they certainly, just because there hasn't been a change made doesn't mean that they're tolerant or content with the way things have gone. That's definitely not the case.
Yeah, 2 goals against Seattle, by far the most productive game.
Yeah, and so good goals too.
Yeah, exactly. And Polito got one of them, so it was great to see him score. But that meant 3 goals in the first 10 games.
Exactly.
That is unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the record, it's the way that they've lost. I mean, I think that they've been lifeless offensively, you can say for sure. It was not something I really got that deep into the column other than the final quote, but Mike Illig talked a few times about it did not seem like the team was having fun. And I said, do you mean that they're not giving all effort? And he said, no, I think the effort's there. I don't think it's an effort issue. They don't look like they're enjoying being out there. And that's a chicken and the egg thing. I mean, you should not be enjoying it when the results are what they are. But I thought it was telling that was something that he continued to spot, was that, you know, there's not a lot of – because Sporting's got – I think of those 3 goals, 2 of them gave them the lead. And they didn't win those matches. Like, they had opportunities to celebrate moments within a match. I personally think that how bad they started a year ago played into the mentality once they got 3 or 4 matches into this season and they hadn't won. I think there's the here we go again feeling, and suddenly you became, you know, the 35 home run hitter who went all of April without hitting one.
I like that analogy. They've been tough to watch. They don't seem to play up until the Seattle game, which was actually a entirely different, visual.
Yeah.
But they didn't seem to play with much joy, and not the confidence that I'm used to seeing with them. And the oddest part of that is there are a lot of familiar faces still out there, including the manager.
Yeah.
So, is there a thought that everybody's a little bit older? There hasn't been as much roster turnover, shakeup as there needs to be, depending on too much on veteran guys. I think before we break down the Peter Vermes role, I just wanted to flush out every possibility for why they're not playing well.
Yeah.
Is it formation? Guys out of position? What's your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, this was definitely part of our conversation, because I think more than any other sport, the coach in MLS is required to adapt, especially one that's been the manager since 2009. The NFL has certainly changed since 2009, but not to the degree of which MLS has changed. When you talk about the amount of teams that have come in, the caliber of players that have come in, it'd be like being a college coach at UMKC and then suddenly you get hired at Mizzou, you're going to have to change. Like you're going to have to recruit a different caliber of player all of a sudden. What won, and the Summit League is not going to win probably in the SEC. And I think that there's certainly been a lot of adaptation and evolution of the league itself. And Peter Vermes has tried to win the same way. I said at one point to Mike Illig, I said that 2013 team that won MLS Cup for Sporting Kansas City does not win MLS Cup today because the league is completely different. And there was agreement with that. And I think it would be nice if there was one reason why that they've lost. I think that is part of the danger of pointing to the injuries is when you say, hey, just wait till we get our guys. There is some danger in potentially ignoring the fact that there's some other things that aren't going well either.
Well, is talent one of them? Is this a team that just isn't as talented as some of the better ones of the last few years?
I would say a variety of talent. And what I mean by that is, let's use like the Chiefs wide receivers as an example. Do we think the Chiefs had the most talented wide receiver group in the league last year?
We do not.
But they got a diverse skill set. Marquez Valdez-Scantling does not play the way Juju Smith-Schuster did last year, or the way McCole Hardman or Kadarius Toney played. I think when you look at Sporting Kansas City's offense, there is some reasonable questions as far as, do Johnny Russell and Daniel Shalhoub, are they too predictable because they play similarly on the outside? Even if they have different abilities to do some things, it's a lot of get the ball at their feet before they get to the back line and then try and make them go through some guys. I think that's part of the offense that's certainly gotten stale. The irony is their defense has actually gotten better this year than it was last year. I still think their center backs, now they've got a new guy with Rosario that I think is better. But I think it's certainly fair to question whether or not they have the same talent that some of these other teams in the league do.
Well, and the talent evaluator and is the one who coaches the team as well. And we're going to talk about Peter Vermes when we come back. So let's take a break. We're back on SportsBeat KC, the Kansas City Star's daily sports podcast, and we're talking Sporting KC with columnist Sam McDowell. How long were you the Sporting beat writer?
Let's see, it took over a month before they won in 2013, so I guess it was like five and a half seasons. And continue to follow them pretty closely when you stop covering them as a beat. And boy, I remember when they changed when Sporting changed its identity from the Wizards to Sporting. I remember thinking, that's a silly name. But it turns out it was a wonderful marketing strategy. Absolutely,
and they are continue to be a standard setter when it comes to kind of off the field branding and imaging, and they're just terrific. I think it's one of the reasons that the World Cup wanted to come to KC is just because of what Sporting has become,
certainly, and
what the facilities are like there. So that doesn't change. What has changed is success on the field. On the pitch, it hasn't been there for the last year and since the beginning of 2022. But Peter Vermes has been there because he's always there. He's been the manager since 2009. Former Kansas City Wizard. In fact, I think he's the only person in MLS history to play for and win as a manager an MLS Cup.
Yeah. But been the manager 5 years longer than anybody else in MLS.
Longest
at
tenure.
The current job.
And according to Sporting Kansas City's website, which I looked this up, he's sixth in the world among global soccer coaches. Longest tenured coach.
Wow.
When you think about how often you hear about top teams turning over their coaches, I thought, wow, that's pretty remarkable to be the sixth longest. If that's true, and I don't know how many leagues they surveyed for that, but that's pretty impressive. A few years ago, before you became the columnist, Vahe Gregorian, Sam Mellinger, and I were discussing the best coaches, managers in Kansas City sports history, and Peter Vermes was on that list. Just all time.
Yeah.
And now there are boos at Children's Mercy Park for the team, and I suspect directed toward him as well.
Yeah.
And that just strikes me odd. And I'm not saying the conversation shouldn't be had. It absolutely should be had. That was part of your reason for the story. But I guess I never thought I would see it come to this.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I totally agree with the sentiment you just laid out. Is that it's really unusual having covered this team for 5.5 years. And I mean, listen, we were critical of them back then, but it was in a way we're critical of the Chiefs now. It was like,
right.
Well, we think we're critical because we think you guys have the ability to go deep in the playoffs. That hasn't happened. Right. That's what we would continue to talk about on the aftermath of that 2013 season. I really didn't envision, especially so abruptly, that we'd be having this conversation as far as, is he going to remain on as the manager? I mean, you mentioned it. He's the longest tenured guy in MLS. He's been around so long. And, you referenced the World Cup. We don't have the World Cup without Peter Vermes.
Absolutely not.
I think he's the single most important figure we've had in Kansas City soccer since the birth of MLS. And it's just really unusual because I went down. You mentioned the Super Bowl. I went down back a month later to go to Royal Spring Training, and the Royals were Sporting Kansas City was finishing up its last week of its version of spring training out in Arizona, and he had just signed a 5-year extension. And I did ask him at that, and I asked Mike Illig at that point about the timing of them not having a great year last year and giving him this extension. But at that point, that bad year was an outlier. And this year now suddenly becomes part of the trend that includes last year. But at that time, I thought, I even asked him, I said, how long do you want to do this? I mean, I just always had envisioned that would be when Peter Vermes walked away, is when he decided, I don't really want to do this anymore. I don't have the same energy I used to have. And that came up in our conversation with Mike Illig as well. I said, do you still see the same intensity? He said, more than ever. He said, this is the type of stuff that drives him as much as anything.
Well, it's good to hear. And I'm not surprised to hear it either.
No, if you know his personality.
Right. If you know him, he is a driven guy.
Yeah. Well, I thought after, because I got on the Zoom call after Sunday's match against Seattle, and I don't get on all the post-game Zoom calls, but he was not in a good mood. And I had heard that earlier in the week it was kind of the same way this week as we talk here on Wednesday afternoon. And that's kind of been his personality, is when you win, he still wants to find something that you need to do better. Andy Reid always calls every game is a lesson of some sort. I think for a long while now, Peter Vermes has had, and I know for a fact he's shown the players like clips of them playing well, because confidence has been an issue. And now he's, I think maybe a little bit more back to his normal self after a win, and that includes, being more critical of everything.
Peter is not part of the ownership group. He has bosses, and I guess what I have come to understand now is he's not immovable. I mean, he can be replaced. As far-fetched to me as that sounds, if the results don't improve, it sounds like Mike Illig and Jake Reid are willing to, make a difficult call and replace Peter Vermes. Reading some social media, there's a certain segment of the fandom that wants that to happen.
Yeah.
And my question is, take a stab at this. Why should it happen? Let's talk about why it could or should happen, and then why it might not happen.
Okay. That's an interesting way to go about it. I guess I would say, if you're part of that segment of the population that does think he should be replaced, I think, first of all, that you probably haven't thought through the aftermath of that as fully as you should. But, the stuff you point to is probably the staleness. I think when you have, I'm trying to think of the name of them, but the MLS has meetings. I think they call them the CSO meetings, like Chief Soccer Officer, because it's not like NFL or Major League Baseball where everyone's called the GM. I guess, baseball, some people are called Vice President of Baseball Operations. Yeah. So and the MLS League Office calls them all Chief Soccer officers, whatever they are. In those meetings, there's only two guys that sit in on those meetings that also coach the team, and it's Bruce Arena and Peter Vermes.
Two of the biggest names in U.S. soccer.
Absolutely. The guys who have earned the ability to have sort of that full control. But I think if you're pointing to one of the reasons why there needs to be a change is dissent is good sometimes. It's
being challenged.
Yeah,
being challenged,
when things aren't going well. You don't just want to have the full autonomy to do whatever you want. It's why Andy Reid didn't want to do that here in Kansas City.
Made it a point. I mean, that was part of him taking the job. He did not want the general manager role.
Yeah, and this season is longer than it ever has been. When he first got that job, the season was probably 6 weeks shorter. Now, there's so much that needs to be going on during the season. I think it's a lot to ask of one person. And I think there's more validity to that argument as far as chipping away at all the hats he wears as opposed to just getting rid of the person altogether. But I also don't really think it works if Peter Vermes is still in the building and suddenly has bosses, for example, or if he's managing somebody who's managing a game. I don't envision how something like that could work.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm old enough to remember a time in college sports where the head football coach or the head basketball coach was also the athletic director.
Yeah.
There was a time when that was common, and that was basically a way to give the coach a little more money.
Sure, yeah.
But that doesn't happen anymore, and there's a good reason for it. The athletic director, the general manager, the technical director, however you want to call it, the role became too important.
Yeah,
basically talent acquisition role.
And that's a really good comparison because especially the way you phrased it, that role became too important. The MLS league used to be about who had the best domestic players, and you had some designated players that were foreign players that were major factors for sure. But that player pool, when you have 28 teams as opposed to 20, it's different. I don't think that we would say that the American player pool is, that's what, adding on 33% of your league. I don't think we think it's 33% better than it was 10 years ago.
Right.
But that same talent is spread across 28 teams. The talent acquisition is much more difficult than it used to be, especially when you're recruiting a higher level of player. And so that's why, like I said, if you're on the argument that there needs to be a change, I think that's what you look at is that one guy wearing too many hats has caused him to be spread too thin, and that's why maybe there hasn't been, like you referenced, as much change as there's needed to be.
All right, so then how does Peter Vermes and Sporting Kansas City dig their way out of this? And what's the argument for Peter Vermes being the best person to lead Sporting out of this?
Yeah, I think his track record speaks for itself. I think the injuries thing is real. They've played well with these two guys in the lineup. I do think the way Mike Illig phrased it, it's not a fair evaluation. I think it's fair to evaluate what he's done without these guys, but maybe it's not a full evaluation until you see the group that he intended to put together. I've heard so many times from that building, what if the Chiefs didn't have Patrick Mahomes and Travis Kelce? And the world would be aware of it, but for one. I mean, there's fantasy football. Everybody would know.
Yep.
We saw what the Texans were when suddenly Deshaun Watson was out for a whole year.
Right. There's a reason these guys are making $50 million.
Yeah, and there's a reason that Alan Pulido and Gotti Kienzer are the two most expensive players on Sporting Kansas City's roster. They are their two most talented players. It's fair to let him play with these guys. I also don't see the advantage of an in-season change because of what we just mentioned. He wears so many hats that I think it's not going to be an overnight thing to suddenly replace all that he does. I think if you're going to make a change, it needs to be in the off season. The in-season change is this message to fans that it's not been good enough. I think that you can make that same message in the off season and get through a season if that was your intention, and therefore you've got way more data to gauge the job that he's done. But the last thing I would just say is if Peter Vermes got fired tomorrow, there are 20 teams in the league that would prefer to fire their own guy to hire Peter Vermes.
I have no doubt about that. I really do. I have no doubt that that is the case. So they've played 11. There's 23 to go. So they're a third of the way through the season. They did pick up their 3 points in Seattle. If they put together 2 segments of winning records over they could put themselves into a playoff position.
Yeah, that's certainly.
They've added. There are more teams in the MLS, but there's more playoff positions as well.
There's 9 teams that make it now. The 8-9 is a play-in. I think they're calling it. The NBA calls those play-in games, and you don't technically make the playoffs unless you win those. I don't think that's how it works in MLS. I think you technically would make the playoffs even if you do play in that play-in 8-9 game. But I think they're only like 6 points out of that with, like you said, 23 some odd matches to go. Like you've got plenty of time, but you have to play better than those teams ahead of you need to play. Like you don't have the margin for error that Seattle does, or I don't know how talented St. Louis is, for example, but they've certainly offered themselves a lot more margin for error than Sporting has.
And they're coming up pretty soon, actually.
By a couple weeks.
Yeah, I think by the end of May. So we'll talk about that game because I'm kind of fascinated by a Kansas City St. Louis soccer rivalry. But I mean, look, maybe it's the older I get, the more sentimental I get about these things. But I want to see Peter Vermes succeed because I've always seen him succeed. And now he's in a place where he hasn't been, and I'm betting he can get his way out of this thing. He has seen, I'll tell you how much he has seen in Kansas City. I added this up. All competitions, MLS and U.S. Open Cup, etc., 527 games.
Yeah, wow.
That's a lot of of games for him.
He's seen pretty much everything, and I guess I would comment on just. There's some people that I think that this has been a long leash. This has been going on for, a couple of years ago, they should have been the number 1 seed in the West if they'd finished out. They just won their last match. Right. We're talking about the number 1 seed in the Western Conference. I understand this is 2 bad years, and people absolutely should be frustrated with the way it's gone over the past 15 months. This guy has earned a leash. And, Chicago and the New York Red Bull fired their coaches earlier this week. The Chicago Fire coach had a worse record just over the last 15 months. That was his full record. That's all the data you had on that coach.
There was no resume there.
Exactly. Like Peter Vermes has earned himself a longer leash, certainly than the guy who picks up from the Chicago Fire at the start of the 2022 season. I think it's a little disappointing. It's not disappointing that some people think that the right move is to make a change. And if that's what you think, I disagree this is the right time, but I think you could go through the argument, and if that's where you fall, that's where you fall. I do think it's disappointing that some people have resorted to chanting for his dismissal at a match. I think that what he's given this club, and even his track record alone, he deserves a better outcome than that. But I also think he deserves a better showing from what he's given this city than something like that.
I think it also means that the fans care enough about a team and an organization that he created.
It's a great point. And listen, I actually think, and I brought this up to some people within that organization, it's not the worst thing in the world that something like that happened at a match, because when Sporting rebranded, what did they want? They wanted fans to become passionate about their team. That shows that they are passionate about, it's not just about going to see the new stadium anymore. They care about the team that's in the stadium. They care about if they win or lose. They want to hold people accountable. It's a good moment for the organization itself to have fans that care enough that they're following this stuff.
Well, maybe they can get a second straight victory. They do play U.S. Open Cup on Thursday. Did we determine that? It's Wednesday, which is today, the day we're recording. So they're down. It's Houston, right?
Yeah.
But Saturday, MLS returns with Minnesota coming to Children's Mercy Park. So, all right, Sam, great column, and we've linked to it in the podcast story that appears on kansascity.com. And great conversation. Thanks.
Thanks, Blair.
That'll do it for today. Thanks to producer Randy Mason for putting together the show, and to our SportsBeat KC staff. of Monty Davis, Jeff Rosen, and Scott Chasen. Tip of the cap to Sam McDowell for sharing his insights, and you can find his column about this topic on kansascity.com. Speaking of websites, check out the best digital sports page in America, the Morning Sports Edition. Today's is packed with stories about the Royals, the Chiefs, NFL schedules, the NBA and NHL playoffs, sporting, and so much more. Go to liveedition.kansascity.com to see what I'm talking about. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another SportsBeat KC, where we talk sports in Kansas City every day.